You are watching the recap of the first episode of ISS Research Insights Live on climate and the environment. With this new event series, we're inviting you into the world of ISS. In this first part of the program, we're going to dive right into the Amazon rainforest.
Eso es un impacto territorial y después un impacto social y cultural.
So the project is called All Eyes on the Amazon. Mm-hmm. So we have these partners that are, for example, indigenous people living in the Ecuadorian Amazon. They know very well what is happening in their environment. There is oil being extracted, there is deforestation, there is land use change, and together with them, we develop systems to collect that information on these impacts that they see, on these changes that they see around them, and this information can be then managed by the communities themselves and spread and used for campaigning purposes, for basically all the purposes they like to use them for.
Right.
What we are looking for is not only conservation, but also to defend the rights, the human rights, the nature rights of the people who is inhabiting the Amazon.
The need for change is not new. The injustices are not new. There's been a long-standing resistance against the injustices. But I think the people on the ground who are the ones who are suffering the most have not been listened to, they have not been taken seriously, we have not been accountable to them.
These oil spills that are happening that you saw in the trailer as well, they're actually not accidental. It's not like, oops, it happened again, right?
These are accidents that can be predicted, and most of them could be avoided if you did maintenance, if you did invest in safety, and these investments are not happening because they don't improve the baseline of the companies that are making profits out of extracting these resources. And the problems are even larger because they are surrounded by people that depend really on the environment for their livelihood. Oil doesn't come out, of course, refined from the soil. What comes out is a mixture of gas, oil, and waters. And the main product, in fact, is so-called formation waters. So these are waters that are dirty of hydrocarbons, heavy metals, in some cases also radioactive material.
In the documentary, it said for every barrel of oil, there's 3 barrels of wastewater that go into the environment.
We have more than 400 indigenous peoples and nationalities living just in the Amazon basin, of which more than 60 groups live in isolation. For indigenous peoples, the forest is made up entirely of living selves and the communicative relations that they have with each other. These selves, from the smallest plant to the spirits who protect the whole forest, are as important as humans. And they inhabit the trees, the waterfalls, the lagoons, the rivers, the mountains, composing the Amazon forest as a whole. I would like to encourage you to learn about the initiative of the Quechua people of Sarayaku. It's called the Causaxacha, the living forest. And they understood it as a sacred territory that not only provides a home for all of its inhabitants, the earthly, but the spiritual ones.
You have, in different sites, been compiling evidence of crimes, actually. Is there a particular one that you would really like to highlight?
The violence against human rights, against the lives of the human rights defenders, it's an everyday issue.
Yeah.
Since the beginning of our program in 2018, 6 of our local monitors and partners have been killed in the territories for protecting their forest and their culture. And we really honor them every day and take this fight as our own fight also. Through All Eyes in the Amazon, we have contributed to develop a new deforestation alert system, and it's now available on Global Forest Watch website for free. And it helps track changes in the Amazon in near real time.
Big oil is not going to go away overnight. It's going to take a decade or 2 more before these major oil companies can fall. But when they fall, the solution is not there. After big oil comes big mining. if we move to electric cars, for example, instead of fossil fuel-based cars, electric cars require a lot of metals, including carbon, that need to be extracted again from places like Ecuador. And I think as long as we don't change two things: one, the way we consume, and two, the way we actually distribute the impacts of that consumption, the problem is only being displaced rather than solved at a fundamental level.
What is very important is to think also about the transition in these places that have been affected so long by the oil industry or by the mining industry or by deforestation, extractive activities. Stopping the activities is part of it, but then there is also creating alternatives for these people.
Jojo Nem Singh, can I invite you? Hi, Dr. Jojo Nem Singh. We can agree that oil needs to stay in the ground. We move to renewable energy, but you are raising a serious big red flag here when looking at the geopolitics of this transition, the international power politics, let's say.
Okay, so I think I'll start by two important realities that we're facing now. The first reality is that the whole world has been depending on China for rare earth elements or rare metals. Basically, China's producing between 90 to 95% depending on the metals that we're looking at. So in effect, what this means is that the current renewable energy transition is being paid by China because it's extremely costly for the environment.
What this means, as you explained to me, and I'm still kind of wrapping my head around it, is that we're actually quite unsure about the future of the renewable energy transition. And you told me that we basically have only 3 options if we were to succeed at this renewable energy transition.
In order to meet the climate agreement targets, we need to increase the total demand for copper and rare earth elements by 40%, almost 60 to 70% for nickel and cobalt, and then almost 90% for lithium. Now, one reality we have to first to just really get our head around this is cobalt is mainly produced or being extracted in Congo. Lithium is produced in 3 countries, Argentina, Chile, and Bolivia. Rare earth elements in China. In terms of the options that we have 3 basic options here. The first option is we hope that China remains to be a reliable supplier. Now that option doesn't seem to be very plausible at the moment. In 2010, China began its imposition of what we call an export restriction policy. China does not want to export primary raw materials. They want the mining and the manufacturing of these high-end industrial products to take place in China. Now, if we don't accept that we want to be dependent on China, the alternative is to create an alternative supply chain. Now, the US has begun to move in this direction. Under Biden, he implemented a national review of how much minerals there are in the world, and in particular in the US. But he also began to create dialogues. All of these geopolitical movements is to basically create a supply chain where we're not going to be entirely dependent on China. If this actually happens, maybe we're looking at 20 years' time that we may have an alternative primary supply chain. The third option which is what basically the European Union Green Deal is all about, for example, is to try to address the demand side and try to figure out a way where we decrease the dependence. For example, the EU strategy is to recycle and create and substitute certain minerals in order to so that we can reduce the use of these minerals. Now, this has not been very successful, and we'll still have to see technologically if that's feasible in 20 years' time. But ultimately, the question really here is what kind of changes in our consumption and in lifestyle can we implement both at the household level, at the micro level, and also at the institutional, at the governmental level.
You mentioned the European Green Deal. It says we want to be climate neutral by 2050. And we need the solar panels and the wind turbines, and we need the minerals for that, but we don't want to mine them ourselves. We don't want mines in Europe, right? So we get it from somewhere else with all the destruction that happens there. That's a bit dubious, to say the least, isn't it?
The irony of it, though, is we're not reducing the consumption of the minerals. We're also not reducing the projection of how much minerals we need for the renewable energy transition. I think the renewable energy sector is in a very interesting moment because it's almost the same as the transition 100 years ago between coal and oil. We wanted to move to oil. And then, of course, that created that condition where oil became the motor of industrialization. We're kind of in an interesting moment as well today where we're now rallying around rare earth elements and the renewable sector as the answer, as the technocratic solution to the problem of climate change.
It's very interesting to see that we're in these discussions about climate change, but at the same time, we kind of disconnect climate change from other environmental degradation. And I think that is why we're having so many issues, because we're indeed thinking, okay, what type of solutions can we find for limiting CO2 emissions? But the solutions that we're finding are actually degrading the environment. At the moment, I have 2 research projects. One is focusing on rights of nature, which was already previously mentioned. For instance, the example in Ecuador, where you now have nature actually being given similar rights to humans. So, for instance, the right to be restored or the right to evolve in a natural way, but also having human duties connected to it. So the duties of humans to protect the river or the mountain, for instance, but also having enforcement type of rules.
What needs to be in place for a concept like the rights of nature to work?
The legal structures, the constitutional structures are, of course, very important. But if we look at the places that we've been working in South America, but also around the world, there are many communities that suffer even there are existing legal protections. The case that we looked in Peru with our colleague Martuerta Martinez, indigenous people were fighting to have laws that were put in place implemented for 20 years, and they were never listened to. So I think, and the reason why they were not listened to is precisely because the system in which they're living in does not see indigenous people as worthy of those rights. So you can write as much as you want in the law books, but if you don't actually see people of deserving the protections that they're entitled to, there's not much that you can do to achieve the goals.
Another project that I'm looking into is called Islanders at the Helm, and that looks at climate justice, but from the perspective of the Dutch Caribbean. Because, of course, the Dutch Kingdom is not only the Netherlands here or European Netherlands, but also these Caribbean islands that are dealing with climate change very closely and very deeply.
Can you maybe tell us what you expect this part of the Netherlands, the kingdom, will look like in 100 years?
That's a very challenging question. So climate change is affecting the 6 islands differently, but especially Bonaire is very vulnerable. So they expect large parts of Bonaire actually to disappear in about 100 to 150 years. And that means that some of the communities that are already living there, some of the children that are living there, might not be able to grow old on the island themselves. Other islands will experience more drought that will have an effect on the food supply. So it will definitely ask for a lot of adaptation and a lot of finding alternatives. When we look at, for instance, the bigger negotiations that are going on around climate change, so when we look at, for instance, the agreements that the Netherlands has signed, they do sign those agreements on behalf of the Caribbean islands as well, sort of. On the one hand, European Netherlands is the biggest polluter of all those parties. And that also means that from an international perspective, the Caribbean countries are actually also seen as biggest polluters. But because they are there, they are also the most vulnerable.
All right, Sylvia, let's zoom into your project for a moment. You said to me, like, the Netherlands has become a disaster country. What is the disaster here?
Yeah, I was really surprised myself, and I think it was my colleague Thea Hilhorst who alerted me to the fact that the Netherlands was in 2006 really near the top of the World Disaster Index, and you think the Netherlands, what disaster is happening there, and it really is people dying from heat in the summer, especially elderly people.
Yeah.
Who are living alone at home, and again, this is also due to the structural changes in the welfare state, where elderly people are longer living alone at home. There's less space for them in institutionalized sort of care, and they also are more lonely. They have less people looking after them. And so what happens is that they might forget to drink. Also, your body is different when you age. You don't actually feel that thirsty.
Are there other groups that are particularly vulnerable?
Yeah, I mean, of course, there are those with chronic cardiovascular and other diseases, and disabled people. There's also certain communities with socioeconomic background. So again, it's the effects of heat waves are really unequal. There's the homeless people, of course, that living on the street. Yeah, where do they go? They're not really welcome. So yeah, those are the issues.
Lorenzo, I think that from what I gather, you strongly feel that we need to stop extracting, especially when it comes to oil.
If we take the carbon budget seriously and we look at fossil fuels, a large share of existing reserves of fossil fuels cannot be extracted. So-called unburnable fossil fuels.
Yeah.
In the plans, in the forecasts of oil companies, they will extract more and more. Projections are that more and more is being extracted. And in fact, if you take all the majors, they invest much more in exploring and increasing extraction capacity if compared to their investments in the much touted investments in renewable energy.
If we don't do something about the fossil fuel and the carbon emissions that we have, we're going to end up, not meeting the climate targets. But I think there are some important questions around who's going to pay for this. We have to start thinking about some kind of fair agreement or fair arrangement in terms of who's paying for these minerals, the extracting countries, and then those who are going to be using them. The other thing, I guess, is technology transfer. The more value added, the products that are more valuable, so to speak, that have more income generating effect, are those that are in the industrial application at the end of the value chain, meaning those who produce the wind turbines, those who will produce the solar panels. So some form of redistribution and technology transfer needs to happen immediately if we want to address the equity question here.
Let me try to translate that, what you're saying now, that right now we're extracting a lot from countries and we're just doing that, and the value added is somewhere else.
Yes.
So the countries themselves are not even benefiting from the extraction that's causing so much destruction.
And I guess the most important part is that we really do need to rethink in terms of what the end goal of all of this is. Because if the end goal is we want to have renewable energy so we can sustain existing lifestyle, that's not going to work.
We have to change our ways, right? The end goal, what are we using all of this for? We cannot sustain. But how we can then change that is still quite a big question mark.
Once we recognize that those limits are real and that they're becoming more and more urgent, then we need to make a number of changes. Of course, some of these changes can be made quickly. They're technological, they're policy-based, they're legal changes. But none of this, I think, will fundamentally change the fundamental problem that Yoyo also just touched upon. It's the issue of inequality. Inequality, as long as we can live with inequality, as long as we justify inequality, we will have a number of different problems. It might be, if it's not from fossil fuel pollution, it's going to be pollution from mining. If it's not mining, it's going to be economic inequality. It's going to be the structural violence that Sylvia's, for example, describing. As long as we don't challenge the dominance, primacy of the logic of capitalism, which sees inequality not just as a necessary byproduct, it sees it. Capitalism is built on the logic of creating inequality as a way of enriching some over others. Mm-hmm. So we need to challenge the logic of inequality to be able to challenge the logic of capitalism before we can solve the climate change problem, environmental change in general, and all other social ills that come with them.
It's also interesting to look at how the capitalist system is changing from within to some extent, and it would be nice to have a discussion of whether that's sort of a facade or whether that's really happening.
There are meaningful changes, minimum wage, 8-hour working days. These are fundamental gains that were secured, but the fundamental inequality doesn't go away. Things just get polished a little bit, but the inequality stays.
In every choice that we take every day, we have the opportunity of decide the impact that we are going to have, not only in our own lives, but in the lives of so many people, nature, worldwide.
We still need to remember that sometimes there is a change, but it still exists in the bigger system.
Yeah.
And that means that you have to really pay attention and make sure that there's no infringements.
Yeah.
So a win by itself is not necessarily always the end result. You need to continue to campaign, to support, to really push the boundaries.
We need to dismantle the system that sees certain people as less worthy because they're poor, because they're indigenous, because they're racialized, because of their sex, their gender. We need to eliminate all these different barriers to achieving full dignity in human life.
Yeah.
So when I talk about equality, of course, it has a fundamental economic dimension, but it's more than that. Equality means everyone is entitled to the same protection as a human being for being a human being.
Really the question that looms large. What do we do as citizens? How do we mobilize? How do we break the structural violence that is embedded in these inequality structures that Murat also was mentioning?
Yeah.
Of course, we have human rights, we have this minimum, but I think the discussion will be more and more about what is above the rights. So what are the privileges that we actually need to hand in order for more equality? We're now seeing that when it comes to the COVID-19 pandemic. What do we consider to be our privileges? How can we divide those privileges? And how can we rethink that?